Hi everyone, this is Brandon from Tuta. Today I have the joy of sitting down with Troy Hunt from Have I Been Pwned, and we're going to go ahead and talk about passwords, data breaches, and what you can do to keep your data safe and private on the internet. Troy, do you want to go ahead and maybe introduce yourself for those watching who might not know you?
Yeah, g'day, Troy, Australian, obviously. I started a little website, was a little website called Have I Been Pwned just over a decade ago in 2013. It got unexpectedly popular, and now it seems to be a resource for a lot of people to figure out if they've been in a data breach or not.
Absolutely. Um, Have I Been Pwned was actually personally one of my first steps into cybersecurity and privacy after finding out that I had been included in a data breach, and then I needed to up my game a little bit.
Oh, that's good. I mean, that's why it's there, right? I mean, most of it's
Yeah.
about informing victims and hopefully driving some positive changes in their behavior.
Right. So for you, what were like the main motivating factors for creating Have I Been Pwned? So like what were you doing before you created the website, and what pushed you to go ahead and create it?
So my background is as a web developer. So I started building web apps in the mid 90s, and that I used to feel young when I said that, not so much anymore. Anyway, I went into a career doing that. I was actually working for Pfizer, running their application architecture for Asia Pacific, and I was doing something which didn't have me getting hands on code anymore, which I really missed. So I wanted to build something. And this was just after the Adobe data breach. I think that was October 2013 from memory. And I'd found my information in there twice. I'd found both my Pfizer email address and my own personal email address.
Mhm.
And I thought, oh, that's strange because I can't remember giving my data to Adobe, but I had given it to Macromedia because I was a big Dreamweaver user.
Mhm.
And of course, Adobe acquired Macromedia, and my data then flowed into somewhere that I didn't expect. And really, that was kind of the light bulb moment. I'm like, well, how many other people have got data in data breaches in places where they didn't expect it to be?
Mhm.
And I started it with about 150 million records. I think we're about to pass 13 billion
Wow.
now. I thought 155 million was a lot. Well, oh no, we have passed 13 billion. There you go. I wasn't even looking. 13.6 billion at the time of writing. Just
Nice.
after we get off this call, there'll be the 792nd data breach go live as well. So it's a little bit endless, it
And
feels like.
which breach is that?
So this is called Anime League,
Mhm.
and there's nearly 200,000 records in there. So it's a
Wow.
relatively small breach, but this is a website that's had a breach. They've got a disclosure up there on their website, so
Mhm.
that makes my job a bit easier. The fact they already know about it and it's been
Yeah.
disclosed.
Mhm.
But there's what we're looking at, I think about 197,000, 192,134 unique email addresses
Okay.
in this breach. And the fascinating thing about this one is it's their PHPBB has been breached, and that has things like all the direct messages, like private messages, are in there
Okay.
as well, because this is what bulletin boards allow you to do. And
Right.
yeah, for crazy reasons, as we start getting into the privacy side of things as well, people's dates of birth.
Mhm.
So why do you need dates of birth to run
Mhm.
a forum? Because that's often used as a form of knowledge-based authentication, and you can't change it. So
Right.
now, well, that's
Yeah. And then when other websites decide to come out and end up having a breach as well, and they've required it, then cool. You're covered on another website too.
yeah. And the wild thing is that so many of us have been in many different data breaches. I've been in more than 30 data breaches
Mhm.
myself that I know of that are in Have I Been Pwned. There are others
Right.
that I know of that are not in there.
Mhm.
And there are yet others again, which I don't know about. And none of us have any idea how many those are.
Right.
So there is this rich fabric of data about me out there by virtue of just having been on the internet for 30 years.
Mhm. Absolutely. I know one thing that kind of bugs me is so I'm American, and I have a social security number. They're
Yeah.
pretty much all public information at this point. But you want to open a bank account, want to apply for new insurance, you just have to use this number, and people pretend that it's still confidential information, but
But
it's
that's the
not.
wild thing, right? Like they get treated like secrets, but then you have to give them to everyone, and they're an absolute nightmare to change as well.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
good luck, American friends.
yeah. It's a bit of a mess. But so you go through and Have I Been Pwned compiles these databases or these breaches. What are the steps for acquiring this breach data? So I'm a bit of an OSINT nerd, so I'm
Yeah.
kind of into data breaches. I think that's the concept of it is interesting. Um, are these usually, do you receive these data sets from like anonymous, kind of as anonymous tips, or are these something that you kind of have to search out from like from different forums, or like you see they pop up on Telegram? Now
Yeah.
seems to be a place where they kind of spread. What does
It's a
that
whole
process look
mix.
like?
Yeah, look, it's a mix, and to your point about OSINT, it's fascinating how much stuff is out there and discoverable. And there's, that there's a few specific forums where a lot of stuff appears, like you mentioned, a lot of Telegram channels,
Hmm.
stuff gets exposed in. To be honest, after probably like the first week of running the service in December 2013, I never really went looking anymore because people would reach out to me and they'll say, hey, here's some data.
Hmm.
And the fascinating thing that I never saw coming is that the breadth of different parties that would send me data. Now, this includes everything from people, possibly like yourself, browsing around. They found a cache of data somewhere and they think, all
Hmm.
right, this would be useful for Have I Been Pwned. I get that all the time.
Hmm.
People who are the first party to the breach, aka the hackers, who have
Right,
found the
right.
data themselves. And then the one that's really surprised me is the FBI and law enforcement agencies
Hmm.
send data to go into Have I Been Pwned.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and that's fascinating because I think if I had an email from the FBI 10 years ago, I would have been really worried.
Right, right,
Now they reach out and they're like, "Hey, look, we've got this cache of data, particularly from things like malware takedowns or botnet takedowns,
right.
and they want to make that data searchable so that victims can be informed." And I remember one of the discussions early on, they sort of said, look, we're generally not in the habit of just like emailing everyone, because if you get an email that says, hi, we're the FBI, you've been in a data breach, people are going to be like,
Delete.
really? But we're happy to publicly state that if you want to look at your exposure, then you can go to this service
Hmm.
with the funny name run by the guy in the other side of the world
Okay.
and go and search for your data, and it will be fine. And it has actually worked out extraordinarily well for everyone, given the circumstances.
Right. So like with this, you get all this data, and it's like Have I Been Pwned is this nice ethical platform where people can update themselves, they can find out, hey, what passwords do I need to change, what info is really out there about me. But there are other groups that are collecting this kind of data as well. So not necessarily just other hacking groups or people like that, but data brokers. So
Mm,
which
mm,
in turn package this data, which is stolen, and they try to sell it. Um,
yeah.
do you know, what is the legal status of this? I mean, they're doing it, so they must be walking some kind of gray line, but I feel like selling this data, which was stolen, that's pretty shady, right?
I would say the legal status is grey at best.
Yeah.
It's an interesting one, isn't it?
Hmm.
I think it's in a way, it's a very new kind of space, and I
Hmm.
think the law and the legal system tend to always take quite some time to catch up with the technology.
Yeah.
And this premise of having huge volumes of data floating around is something that I just don't think we're well equipped to sort of quantify in terms of legal position in many cases. Now, yeah, sometimes it's pretty clear cut. There are multiple forums I can think of, multiple, I've often referred to them as shady versions of Have I Been Pwned. Very frequently they have the word leak in them. I've sort of
Hmm.
made a bit of a joke about showing this at various talks.
Hmm.
Here's a site that's called something leak this, and this one's leak that. And
Hmm.
notice how everyone's trying to be really anonymous on there. Anyway, now here's all the law enforcement takedown
Yeah.
websites
Yeah.
that are there in the place, because a lot of these were selling data often on the per record basis, and it would be a small amount of money, but you get a lot of people paying this,
Hmm.
advertising and hacking forums with the express purpose of causing harm to the individuals in there. And I've
Right.
had people buy my data before and send it to me, and it's ironically it's data I've already seen before because it's in the
Hmm.
same data breaches that I deal with.
Hmm.
But that's sort of a good example of just how shady it can be.
Hmm.
I think the data brokers in general, when we look at the fact that there is actually an industry of data brokerage,
Yeah.
and at the I guess, most legitimate end of that scale, when people go and they fill out that form because they really want to win that cruise to the Caribbean, and they don't read the fine print. But let's say they read the fine print, and somewhere in there, it's like, we may sell your data to partners and everything else.
Hmm.
There's entire businesses that are built out of the exchange of this data,
Hmm.
and that might operate entirely legally, but it feels icky, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I saw we wrote on this on our blog a few months ago that the news came out that the NSA was buying data from these data brokers, so they could collect
Yeah,
data, this information about Americans, in this case, or people around the world, but not really needing to do any of that dirty work.
it's easier than subpoenas, isn't it?
Yeah,
Just to
absolutely.
go and buy the data.
Yeah.
Um, Look, it's fascinating. Just how, and I don't know, like, what's even the word? Like, how messy, shady, like, messed up the whole thing is. Even recently, there was a spyware vendor who got breached,
Okay.
and there's a whole other story about spyware.
Hmm.
But one of the observations that the infosec infosec outlet had when they wrote the whole thing up is, they said, look, there's like literally people in law enforcement roles in here
Hmm.
that appear to have been buying access to the spyware in order to target victims.
Oh man.
Um, yeah, and it's something that's sort of very. I think actually one of the examples they found was a judge somewhere,
Okay.
and it looks like the judge was trying to monitor their own child, and I think there might have been some reasons why they're extra concerned about the child. But it's like, you're then using, I assume, like a .gov email address in there somewhere
Yeah.
in the spyware. Like,
Hmm.
dude, you go get an email account and don't do that.
Yeah.
Like, no spyware.
Yeah, yeah. So like these, when you get these data sets submitted to you, they're huge. A lot of these are just massive. What does the time investment look like for going through and cleaning up this data before you can release it?
Yeah. Well, in a way, it's kind of easy insofar as we only need email addresses for Have I Been Pwned.
Hmm.
Email addresses you can 99 point something percent reliably extract with the regex.
Hmm.
The exceptions, there's a whole other story. If you go and look at how do you write a regex to match email addresses and actually comply to the RFC and everything, and it's a nightmare. But my theory is that the odd ones that slip through the regexes, you probably aren't really using on many websites anyway, because they tend to be quite strict.
Hmm.
But anyway, I can regex them out. So
Okay.
looking at this incident just now, I mean, how many gigabytes was this? This Anime League we're just talking about. So this was 1.1 gigabytes worth of data,
Hmm.
242 SQL files.
Hmm.
I just run a regex over it. So I've open sourced the code used for this, for everyone can go and have a look at it. And it comes back and it's like, yep, I found 192,134 email addresses, and then this is the distribution of them by file.
Hmm.
That's the easy bit. The harder bit is going, okay, well, what's actually in here?
Right.
And I thought, when I sat down and started doing this like 2 hours ago, I'd be like, this will be easy. And 2 hours in, I'm like, oh wow, and there's a file of users here, and then there's a file of all the DMs, and I need to go through and try and figure out what's the entire scope of impact on individuals, because I need to know, what are the data classes? There are IP addresses, dates of birth we discussed, there are
Hmm.
usernames, email addresses, passwords. There's not just Bcrypt passwords, but there's salted MD5 passwords. There's
Hmm.
SHA-1 passwords. Like, how do I go through and describe that such that when I send notifications to our subscribers,
Hmm.
and very often there's about 1% of a data breach are our subscribers. We're just about to tick over 5 million subscribers.
Hmm.
So in this case, I might send, what's that, a couple of thousand emails to individuals. Like, I want to get this right,
Yeah.
because a number of them are going to be upset, and they're going to contact the Anime League organization here, and they're going to say, "Hey, look, I'm really upset. Have I been punished? That I've had all this stuff here."
Hmm.
So I got to get that right, or else these guys are going to get upset, understandably,
Right.
because I've
Right.
misrepresented something.
Hmm. So now you said that it's the main thing you go through and you can just regex these emails. Aren't you? I believe Have I Been Pwned also offers a platform where you can check your passwords, right?
Yeah, yeah. Hey, the password thing's really cool, actually.
Hmm.
It sort of emerged from NIST guidance. I think it was about 2017. NIST released a whole bunch of guidance around the way we should do passwords as web applications where people sign up to.
Hmm.
And the essence of what they said was, we have been using arbitrary password complexity criteria for decades it
Yeah.
really doesn't work very well,
Right.
because as soon as you need to have an uppercase, you capitalize the first letter, and as soon as you
Mhm.
need a number, you put a 1 on the end, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So what we should be doing is looking at known bad passwords from previous breach corpuses
Mhm.
and then blocking those from future use. Good luck. And they just kind of left it at that. And
Okay.
well, where do you get the passwords from?
Mhm.
Oh, I get a lot of passwords. So I have a very large number of passwords from these breaches.
Mhm.
I did a bunch of work with Cloudflare, who came up with a really neat anonymity model to be able to query the passwords without
Mhm.
actually having to send the password over to the service.
Mhm.
And I'm going to check again now, but the last time I checked, we we're approaching 9 billion queries of this service a month.
Wow.
And you can download the whole thing and run it on-prem yourself, or on your own cloud yourself, or however you want to do it.
Mhm.
So I don't even know how many times it's used, but it's a lot, which is really, really cool.
Yeah. So like with this, you have the on your servers, the Have I Been Pwned servers, emails are there. The passwords are also there. What are the like what steps are you taking to keep those things apart? Like what are like we're using kind of some different zero knowledge architecture to keep our users safe. What is Have I Been Pwned doing to keep those like not unaffiliated with each other?
There's a really easy answer. You just don't put them together.
Yeah.
Like it's that simple.
Yeah.
Uh, now, to maybe give this a little bit more shape, the email
Mhm.
addresses from a database, let's say it's this Anime League one, because it's the top of my head.
Mhm.
I'll go in there, I'll regex out those email addresses. That will get loaded as one corpus.
Mhm.
We won't be loading any passwords for this, because we need passwords in plain text. So
Mhm.
when we've got passwords that are bcrypt hashes, I'm not going to go through cracking hashes. That's
Right.
pointless. And besides which, the word list I'd use is the list that I already have, and those passwords are already in the service. So
Yeah.
what's the point? So generally speaking, now the only time we put more passwords in the service is if
Mhm.
we come across a significant corpus of plain text passwords that we haven't seen before.
Mhm.
And the other thing is we have a law enforcement ingestion pipeline where the likes of the FBI feed passwords that they've discovered during the course of their investigations into this service.
Mhm.
And they actually feed them through as both NTLM and SHA-1 hashes.
Mhm.
Not that we really want to store passwords like that in a live, let's say, web-based system.
Mhm.
But what we wanted to do is we didn't want to get plain text passwords or store plain text passwords or make plain text passwords searchable,
Yeah.
simply because a bunch of the time these passwords come from people that have maybe prepared credential stuffing lists
Mhm.
or other folks who maybe haven't done a great job of parsing out the data. And some passwords, air quoting
Mhm.
people listening, are actually in the entire line with the PII, and it's it might be an entire like SQL insert statement.
Mhm.
If we SHA-1 hash that gives it way more protection than what it actually needs, such that that's not going to be reverted back. You literally have to recreate that entire line and then hash it and compare it to effectively crack it.
Mhm.
So anyway, the point is that we give law enforcement agencies this pipeline where they can feed in these hashes. They go into the corpus, and it is 8.68 billion requests in the last 30 days as of today,
Wow.
which is pretty cool.
So has there been talking about getting these submissions from law enforcement? Has there been a big uptick in that with the rise of like Stealer log malware?
It's a bit of a mix. To be honest, I haven't even looked at our ingestion logs for a while, so I don't
Okay.
know how much it's being used. And this is kind of the joy of it, because it's just self-sufficient.
Hmm.
It's massively cached by Cloudflare, so we don't see when there's big spikes of activity or anything like that.
Hmm.
We make that ingestion pipeline available to be able to feed in new stuff. I don't know if it's been used every day in the last week or it hasn't been used since the start of the year. We probably should do some analytics and some numbers on that. I think people would find that interesting.
Okay. So talking about more kind of broader with data breaches around the world. When a site gets breached, are there some like what are some of these main points of entry? Does this happen mainly due to oversights on the behalf of like a site operator, where you see things like scrapes happening, something's not locked down the way it should be, or are these
Yeah.
unknown exploits that are being used? What is the majority here?
It's a mix. I mean, we're recording this at least here in Australia, the last day of July at the moment. April, May, June was massive in terms of Snowflake. A whole bunch of data taken from Snowflake
Hmm.
with working credentials obtained via a combination of, looks like, Stealer logs and a third party that had stored them.
Hmm.
165 odd organizations. Now, So what's the vulnerability there? Well, accessible credentials. It's like literally log into the service and pull the data back.
Right, right.
I was replying to one today, exposed MongoDB, and someone sent me all their data.
Hmm.
This one today for Anime League, I would suspect that someone had admin credentials and just got in and dumped everything. That's
Hmm.
what it looks like. Publicly facing database backups is a bit of a recurring theme as well. It's
Yeah.
like literally my database.back accessible over HTTP because someone's uploaded it to the website.
Hmm.
So, there's not one thing, and I don't think there's sort of one dominant thing at the moment.
Hmm.
We see occasions where it's something like the snowflake situation where there's obviously a particular technique being used and that just wreaks havoc for a bit and that gets closed down and they move on to something else.
Hmm. So it's these targeted attacks. So if you're an employee at one of these like third party providers, you're gonna get spearphished, or there's like these phishing attempts to try and get those credentials, right?
Yeah,
That is.
totally. And look, I mean, obviously, if you can get credential sets and literally log into the service and use it, I was going to say use it in the way it's meant to be used, but
Yeah.
log in without breaking through any application security provisions.
Hmm.
That's gold for attackers, right?
Absolutely, and it's terrifying for the users because
Yeah,
this
yeah,
is something that I find kind of frustrating. There's almost this feeling like there are so many attacks now that are these what do you call it? Not service side, but kind of these vendor. There's an attack on a vendor,
yeah.
um, who then or like what was the name of the attack method by SolarWinds? What are those called? It's out
Uh,
of my head right
it's,
now.
it's going to bug us if we don't find it. But I mean, this is the sort of thing. And I think to your point, there are so many different services out there now that
Hmm.
we are dependent on. And it makes a lot of sense. If you're going to be, let's say it's the snowflake situation, because it's
Hmm.
just such a big news story. If you're going to require large volumes of cloud-based storage, are you really going to roll your own and stand up your own VM somewhere? Or are you going to go and use a service somewhere where
Yeah.
someone has bundled all this up for you and they give you all the other stuff on top of it?
Hmm.
And we see time and time again vulnerabilities in external dependencies that then bring the organization undone, potentially through no fault of their own as well.
Hmm. Right. And yeah, that's like a thing that I find frustrating is okay, cool. I can kind of try and cover it on my end as best as I can. Not that I'm like perfect,
Yeah.
but you can do your best, and then on that back end side, then it's open. It's kind of a point of frustration.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Oh,
So now with you talked a little bit about password hashing. So most passwords, ideally, they should be hashed. I think that is a pretty standard suggestion from NIST, right? So you mentioned in that list there MD5 hashes and SHA-1 hashes, which to my
yeah.
knowledge should no longer be used.
No.
How often do you see these? Because I found an article, it's from 2019, saying a quarter of content management systems were still using MD5.
Yeah, look, it's wild. I was just looking up the article. So I wrote a blog post called "Our Password Hashing Has No Close,"
Hmm.
and it just went through and it showed how weak even salted SHA-1 was.
Hmm.
This is June 2012.
Yeah.
Right, there's like a dozen years on. Here we are, but to your point, and I literally have this data in front of me right now. This is the PHP users SQL file
Hmm.
from the Anime League, and I'm looking at this, and this is MD5, and I know it's MD5 because it's 32 bytes long. And there is a column called password hash, and there's another one called salt, so we know it's salted.
Yeah.
And the fascinating thing about this is that as I scroll down through the data, the further down you get, the more bcrypt there is.
Okay.
So what appears to have happened, and this is inevitably PHP BB's implementation,
Hmm.
they've rolled at some stage from MD5, which is terrible, to bcrypt, which is usually good, depending on our work factor there as well. And they've got a
Hmm.
work factor of 10, which is very, very common, which probably should be higher by now. But anyway,
Okay.
uh, so what they've been doing is inevitably waiting for people to log on. And then they log on and they take the password and they validate it against the old salted MD5 and they go, that
Hmm.
password's correct. Now we're going to take that plain text password, we're going to create a bcrypt hash and we'll store that.
Hmm.
And that user's now okay.
Hmm.
And every time I've run workshops, I do this Hack Yourself First workshop. We spend 2 days doing stuff like this.
Nice.
And I'll sort of say to people, how long is it going to take you if you do this? How long is it going to take you for every single one of your users to log in so that you can protect their password better?
Hmm.
And they go, infinity? It's like, yeah, that's
Yeah.
how long it
Hmm.
takes. And there are so many data breaches where people get caught halfway through or partway through that
Yeah.
rollover. Dropbox is a great example. Dropbox had a heap of SHA-1 and a heap of bcrypt just
Hmm.
because they were partway through that. There's a really easy solution. You can go through and just bcrypt all your SHA-1s. Like just take your old, choose the right word here, poor hash, take
Yeah.
your old poor hash
Yeah.
and hash it with the new good one. And you got a hash inside a hash and who cares? That's fine. At least it gets everything done in one go.
Hmm. So for users at home who might not understand the cryptography terms here, so salting hashes, um, what is could you go ahead and explain what is a hashing function and what
Yeah.
does it mean to salt a hash, or are we just talking about like cooking recipes here?
Good question. So a hash is a one-way deterministic algorithm.
Hmm.
Now, one way is a bit self-explanatory. You can hash, but you can never unhash.
Right.
Now, a massive sort of bone of contention with me is the number of times you see someone say it's encrypted. In fact, even now, I feel bad picking on these guys, but they're just the ones that are top of mind now. Looking at the Anime League disclosure notice, they said there were hashed forum passwords and then in brackets encrypted. It's like, no,
Eh.
these two don't. Only the encrypted passwords used for the forum are breached. No, they're not encrypted. So encryption has a key. Either you've got a private key or a private key and a public key, depending on
Right.
symmetrical or asymmetrical encryption. You can encrypt something and then you can decrypt it. And you can take something that's very small and you'll get a very small output. And then you take something very large, you get a very large output because all of the integrity of that source file or string or whatever it may be is retained. When you hash, if it's MD5, you always end up with 32 characters. If it's SHA-1, you always end up with 40 characters. You always end up with this one output.
Hmm.
So it is one way. You cannot go the other way. And just the fact that whether it's a 2-character password or a 2,000-character password, you always end up with 32 characters of MD5 just
Hmm.
goes to show there's some loss.
Yeah.
So it is one way. Now, the deterministic nature of it means that when you repeat the same process, you apply the same algorithm to the same input string, you get the same output.
Right.
And what that really means is that when you come along to a website and you register and you give it a password, you can hash it regardless of the algorithm, store it. And then when you come back next time and you log in, we can take that password, hash it, and then just compare the two. We don't compare passwords, we compare
Hashes.
hashes
Yeah.
because that achieves the objective of figuring out whether the password at login is the same one as the password at registration. And it does it without storing the password.
Hmm.
However, if we store the hash and it's deterministic, and if at some point in time we have a map between plain text and a hash, we used to have things called rainbow tables where
Yeah.
we get
Yeah.
massive pre-computed lists of
Hmm.
plain text strings and hashes. These days we have Google, and you can Google any unsalted, we'll come back to salt, any unsalted SHA-1 or
Hmm.
MD5 password that's been in circulation, and you will find, by searching for that hash, you'll find the plain text.
Hmm.
Or you can take a list of plain text candidates,
Hmm.
strings, possible passwords, hash them and compare them. And the problem with the hashing algorithms like MD5 and SHA-1 is that we can pre-compute those, or we don't have to pre-compute, that was rainbows, but we can compute those hashes so quickly that you can check tens of billions of hashes per second on consumer grade hardware. And I'm just looking again at my blog post here from 12 years ago.
Right.
It's got an AMD Radeon GPU here because GPUs are very fast at password hashing. So the idea of having a salt is to make sure that if we have the same password, we don't end up with the same hash. So a salt adds randomness. So we have the
Hmm.
plain text string, which is the password. We add the salt, which is unique for every user,
Hmm.
such that if every user in the database uses exactly the same password, so long as they have different salts, they get different hashes. So now we can't just go and Google it.
Hmm.
We can still do that computing via the GPU, and we can still compute tens of billions of potential hashes per second, which is why we then move to things like bcrypt and PBKDF2 and script and argon and all the rest of it, where they're very slow.
Hmm.
And this is the thing that does developers' heads in, because they're like, I want to go fast. You're like, oh, yeah, but fast is not good.
Yeah.
Because if you have too many computations of the hash in too short a time, well, then that weakens the password because they're easier to crack. But look, I mean, all of this is really only a valid discussion when you have hashes, which of course is why you do hashing in the first place. None of this has any bearing on credential stuffing attacks or
Hmm.
brute force against login schemes. All of that hashing and comparison happens behind the scenes. It's really about when you end up with a data breach such as Anime League
Hmm.
and you want to go through and crack people's passwords,
Yeah.
how much protection is there?
Hmm. So we went through, and for quite a while we were using bcrypt, but we've recently switched to Argon 2 because one of the things that we're focused on right now is the potential threat of quantum computers. So we made this
Mm.
shift to Argon 2 for our key derivation. Because right now we're using user has a password. Well, they use that password to kind of derive their key set for encrypting, decrypting emails. Is something like this for different websites, focusing more on this key derivation model, is something like that reasonable for most websites, or is that going to be overkill? Um,
I like what I like the blog post Dropbox wrote after their incident. So they got
mhm,
breached in 2012. The data started circulating in 2016. Went into Have I Been Pwned. Everyone's got the Dropbox data now.
yeah.
And afterwards, they came and wrote a blog post about how they now do their password storage. And it was kind of interesting because from memory, what they did is they took the password, they did like a SHA-512 hash out of it, which is a fairly sort of high entropy hash. They then bcrypted it, and they
Hmm.
bcrypted it because otherwise bcrypt would truncate the string to 72 characters. And if you've got a really, really big password,
Hmm.
you don't want to lose the detail. And then they encrypted that. So they actually had a hash inside encryption, which I think is the only time I certainly haven't seen it in a data breach.
Hmm.
And that was kind of cool because now it's like, well, we actually need to have a key compromise in
Yeah.
order to decrypt and get hashes. And then if you do get the hashes, then we get all of the resilience of a high work factor algorithm that is going to take you a long time to crack. So I think moving in those sorts of directions beyond just hashes, which do get cracked, is a positive thing. Very often I end up finding myself increasingly these days, now that we're talking about all the dependencies we create on third-party services, is
Hmm.
saying, look, there are lots of other platforms out there that will do the whole authentication thing for you.
Hmm.
Now, I don't necessarily think that logging on with Facebook is a good idea, but you can build a custom application, and there's a
Hmm.
whole other issue. There's social issues with that.
Hmm.
You can build a custom application and use Azure Active Directory services, and they will take care of not just the storing of the passwords, but the protection against brute force and the multi-factor authentication and all
Hmm.
of the other things that you as a developer probably don't want to get into the weeds in.
Right. Right. So we talked about the different hashes and that like the kind of weaknesses facing certain types of hashes or hash functions. How often is there a breach and passwords were just stored in plain text? It still
Look,
happens, right?
I do feel it's less frequent. I just wanted to go to the Have I Been Pwned, Who's Been Pwned
Hmm.
page, and literally search for plain text. How many occurrences do we have there? 100 occurrences of plain text on the who's been pwned. I feel that it is less frequent,
Hmm.
um, simply because we are very, very slowly raising the bar. But there are still so many incidents in here from very, very recent times in the last few years
Hmm.
where it's still plain text. And I think part of the challenge is it's just a very, very long tail of different services out there.
Hmm.
Even this throwing Anime League under the bus again, looking at this situation today, inevitably storing passwords in MD5 is something that PHP probably hasn't done for many, many, many years.
Hmm.
But I don't even know how long this thing's been around. Maybe it's
Yeah.
been out there for 15 years
Hmm.
and it worked, and they didn't touch it again.
Hmm.
And to be honest, it's one of the reasons why I really like using managed platforms for things like forums. If you want to run a forum, go and use hosted vBulletin where they manage the whole thing for you, and you're not there having to patch and upgrade and move
Right.
with the latest technology, because people don't, and it sits there and it gets stagnant, and eventually they get breached because they haven't patched it,
Hmm.
and your passwords are stored in a very weak fashion.
Yeah. So with that, where things say that something doesn't get patched and there is a breach, um, what are some of the, I mean, we could talk the US alone, for example. What kind of breach reporting laws are in place? So, company has a
Oh,
breach, and
mm.
then there's say it comes out that okay, well, they were using, like in this one case, there was not a patch. What kind of big is there a big liability there, legally speaking, where okay, say there's, oh well, we were using MD5 hashes, so your passwords are fudge. Um, is there any way of like being held accountable for weak security practices, or we not there yet?
I think there's maybe a two-part answer here. As far as I know, there are no direct regulations that penalize organizations based on the hashing algorithm of choice.
Hmm.
Now, indirectly, I can imagine a case being made that there are insufficient security controls put on data to
Hmm.
sufficiently protect it. I think one of the things I find really fascinating is, I sit here in my office in Australia on the other side of the world to most people,
Hmm.
looking at all these data breaches. Data breaches are so global in nature, but then of course we've sort of balkanized the world where we've got all these different countries and all their own laws. Or if you're in America, all your states with different laws.
Yeah.
So as you go between different parts of the world, you're going from our Office of the Information Commissioner's regulations here in Australia to GDPR in Europe to
Right.
CCPK in California, and all of these regulations. Fortunately, I think there's a lot of alignment, but there's also a lot of bespoke requirements around the way things like reporting are done, and
Hmm.
particularly around the way things like penalties are leveled,
Hmm.
or my personal favorite at the moment around disclosure.
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
most of the world, there is not a requirement to disclose
Hmm.
to individuals after a data breach. This is something I think, particularly in Europe, because we were all so excited about GDPR. When was that? About 2018. We're all so excited. It's like, this will fix it. They'll have to tell everybody, and then they'll get fined 4% of their gross annual worldwide turnover and extraterritoriality and everything. And time again, we're seeing data breaches where a regulator might be notified, but not the individuals.
Right.
Something like Deezer, the French streaming media service. I think there are about 225 million people in there.
Hmm.
They notified the French regulator. They didn't notify the individuals.
Hmm.
I notified the individuals. And I believe after that, their hand was sort of forced. But
Yeah.
I just find it wild to have your data in a breach and the organization goes, oh, we don't think we need to let them know.
Hmm.
How do we not regulate that out of existence?
Hmm. And that was something that I thought was interesting. Like for a non-anime league example, the Ticketmaster
Yeah.
breach for a couple weeks ago. Um, I remember first seeing that, just seeing it in the news, and how long it took before there was kind of finally this official statement of okay, did it happen or did it not happen? Where's our confirmation here? It was like frustrating that that didn't come sooner. But I suppose they also
Yeah.
have to triage. Like that's not they have to triage an incident, right?
Yeah, I think all of this is a question of degrees of time.
Hmm.
And if we think about what are the steps that most organizations have to go through, well, that they first hear about a data breach, often from me,
Hmm.
but sometimes it's the hacker saying, can I have money, please? So that they hear about this, they have to establish what's been compromised, so what data has actually been taken. They have to try and figure out whether the attack vector is still there, because obviously their first priority is going to be closing that down.
Hmm.
They're cautious about disclosing information publicly too soon because they don't want to alert people to the fact there may be an ongoing vulnerability that other people go and exploit. But increasingly, what I'm finding is that the delay is induced by rooms full of lawyers trying to spin it in such a way that they have less class actions as a result of the
Hmm.
incident. And I have so many examples of this where this is done in the best interest of the organization. And I guess ultimately that their accountability is not to their customers, their accountability is their shareholders. And they're trying to preserve shareholder value and all the rest of it. But individuals like you and I and every single person listening to this later on, it's to our detriment. Our data is out there floating around. And I have this very clear picture in my mind about how valuable that data is very early on after a breach.
Hmm.
And as time ticks by, more and more damage is done to people. And in
Yeah.
fact, I think the data becomes less valuable over time because very early on, people are like, hey, why is someone logging into my socials? Well, because you use the same password on this site that just got breached. You didn't know they got breached because they're too busy talking to their lawyer.
Hmm.
And this is just probably sense the frustration I have at the moment.
Mm,
Seeing this happen over and over again, and part of my frustration as well is there are so many incidents where I have this data that if I load it into Have I Been Pwned and I tell everyone, and I don't know if the organization knows about it,
mhm.
that puts them in a very awkward situation. And
Right.
it jeopardizes my ability to keep running the service too, because I don't want to get sued out of existence.
Yeah, for
Well,
sure.
that's not going to be good for anybody either.
Mhm.
So I'm constantly battling with how do I walk that tightrope and figure out better ways to get disclosure, better ways to get data loaded early, and better ways to let just the individuals know what's happened.
Mhm. Mhm. So we talk about like what this problem is. Like data breaches aren't going to go away. There's a ton of them. There's pretty much a new major breach every week. What are some recommendations for things that people can do at home, like the regular average Joe, that they can do to kind of protect themselves? What are some top tips or best practices that you could recommend
Yeah.
to protect yourself from
Well,
this?
I think the first thing is to recognize that you cannot stop yourself from being in data breaches. As I
Right.
said before, I've been in more than 30 myself, and sometimes I'll do interviews with like more mainstream media, and they go, "Even you, but you're the expert at this." Like, well, I can't stop hackers breaking into someone else's system. Like I don't have control over that.
Right.
And even in cases, I've thinking of one example here: the Australian Red Cross Blood Service. I didn't even put data in a computer system. I went to the blood van and I had a piece of paper and a pencil,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
that data got digitized and ended up in the system. I have no control over that.
Hmm.
I do have control over what information I provide all of these
Right.
parties. We're just talking about dates of birth. The time and time and time again, seeing dates of birth there. And the world shouldn't be this way, but it turns out that we are very dependent on dates of birth as a form of static knowledge-based authentication.
Hmm.
And it's nuts because I'd love to be able to share my birthday and go, hey, I'm having a birthday, send me good wishes and presents and
Hmm.
things like that. But it's just kind of wild that that is a piece of information used to verify your identity. So why do we keep asking for it? In sites like Anime League, it's like, why ask for this? And funnily
Yeah.
enough, one of the things people often say is they say, well, it's because of COPPA, Child Online Protection Act. You got to ask because you got to make sure that they're 13 or older.
Hmm.
And I kid you not, time and time again, I'll say, well, why don't you just ask if they're 13? You don't have to ask for their date of birth. You just have to say, are you older than 13? Yes or no. Every time I go to a site about beer in Australia, it says, are you over 18? And you say yes, and you go in.
Hmm.
Now, people then say, you can't do that because people could lie.
Well, they're totally
Have
not
you,
going to lie about their birthday, right?
ah, have you seen how many people are born on the 1st of January, in data breaches? I
Yeah.
must actually start quantifying that sometime. It's nuts. So
Hmm.
it I just find we constantly end up with competing objectives around the information we collect in order to run services, and then the risk it puts people at. You mentioned social security numbers before. In Australia, we've had a couple of big incidents that have leaked driver's license numbers, and driver's licenses are a form of identity verification
Hmm.
here in Australia. And we had one in particular about 18 months ago of our second largest telco that resulted in tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of people, because there are millions of people in the breach,
Hmm.
lining up at motor vehicle registries to go and get new driver's licenses. It's like
Yeah.
that's nuts. Like you have a few numbers, and that's
Hmm.
enough to prove, at least in part, who you are.
Hmm. So one of the things that we've kind of recommended for a lot of our users, at least with talking about having unique passwords, unique strong passwords, is using password managers. I mean,
Yeah,
that seems like it's for people in the privacy space, cybersecurity space, is kind of a no-brainer. But for a lot of people, it's still not a commonplace thing. I'm thinking of my family. I'm thinking of older relatives, right? Um, what are or using email aliasing. So there's
yeah,
different platforms you can do. We offer it internally, but then there are third-party platforms you can use for it as a way of not going through and using that same email address every time, right? So trying to kind of obfuscate and kind of change this information that you're providing. How do we get people to care? An issue that I have, right? So talking with, or not even necessarily that they don't care, but people who may not be extremely tech savvy or don't have this background knowledge, like, I'm not gonna give my grandparents a YubiKey and a brand new password manager and try to get them to use 30 plus character
Mm.
passwords everywhere. Maybe I should. Um, but like, what is the best way to kind of bridge this gap to make more people, bring more people up to speed with better privacy and security practices?
Well, I think you'll find people tend to care once it impacts them.
Hmm.
I noticed the number of times people, yeah, a really good example is I do a piece on our local radio here every Monday morning, and we'll go and we'll talk to the host, and we'll talk about scams and things like this, and I'll
Hmm.
talk about password managers, and every time she'll go, I know I really should get one. It's like, I have offered for you to come to my house, and I will literally have a working bee with you to set you up on a
Hmm.
password manager, but you still haven't done it because she hasn't been hurt by it yet. But at some point in the future, she might be. So I think the answer to how do we get people to care is, unfortunately, it's usually something bad has to happen.
Hmm.
Now, that said, to the example of say, your grandparents, I am very supportive of the idea of a password book. When we
Hmm.
look at the whole risk spectrum, and I find this funny because I've had people send me very disparaging tweets online before where they'll go into a bookshop and there'll be one of those password books. And I go, ha ha, Troy Hunt, like, look at this. It's not even encrypted. It's like, well, okay, but like let's walk through these two scenarios here. At the moment, you've got the vast bulk of people using the same password everywhere, or the same, two or three, or something like that.
Hmm.
They're using them everywhere. Anyone who gets that anywhere in the world can go and log on to any of their services because they're normal humans and they haven't turned on MFA either. Now you have a password book, and you just write the website, pen and paper. My mother does this.
Hmm.
She's elderly. She's in her 70s. Yeah, she writes it in pen and paper.
Hmm.
So what's the risk? Well, first of all, it's someone who can break into her house, right?
Hmm.
Like someone's actually got to break into the house. The person who breaks in the house is going to steal the computer, right? They're not going
Yeah.
to take the book. And if they do take the book, she'll go, "Oh, someone broke into my house and the book is gone. I know my passwords are compromised now." The way it stands at the moment, we don't know when we've been in a data breach.
Hmm.
So I think just looking at things very pragmatically like that. And look, I'd love to get people onto password managers. I think they're one of the very few security constructs we have that actually makes your life easier as well.
For sure.
Yeah, when I show people, even if, let's say it's even a website such as Qantas, every time I log on to Qantas, my password is 4 characters and they're all numeric. And you wouldn't believe it. Every single 4 character numeric password has been breached before.
Yep.
But that's what it is. And it's simple, but I can go in there and go control backslash and then pre-fill, and it fills in all that and it logs me on automatically. And that's wonderful. And
Hmm.
when I do have genuinely long, strong, random, crazy password generator passwords,
Hmm.
like that's awesome. It's such a nice usability experience. And I can barely remember what it was like not having
Hmm.
one.
Right. So, what do you think about people talk about like a passwordless future? We're moving beyond the password. So passkeys are kind of like a sexy term that gets thrown around.
Yeah.
Um, what are your thoughts on passkeys as a secure alternative to the traditional password with MFA?
Well, first of all, I remember doing interviews more than 10 years ago, and people were like, a password's still going to be a thing in 10 years from now.
Right.
Now, I would argue that everybody today has more passwords now than what they did this time 1 year ago. And equally, in 1 year from now, you'll have more passwords than what you do today.
Mm.
You may also have pass keys and you may start to use those more. And I think that they're a very good alternative. I do find them a confusing paradigm, even a confusing paradigm to explain. Are
Hmm.
they bound to the device? Is it what you put on your YubiKey? How do you
Hmm.
sync it? Where do you get, yeah, that there is a lot for people to absorb. And I think that as much as we deride the password for all its faults, the one thing that the password does that so far nothing else has been able to compete with is that every single person knows how to use it.
Right.
And it's the same reason for why we still use things like dates of birth for knowledge based authentication. No matter how technically illiterate you are, you're always able to tell someone the day you were born, or your mother's maiden name, or the school you went to, or the
Hmm.
town you grew up in. All of these things, which are just terrible from security perspective, are fantastic from a usability perspective.
Hmm. Yeah. I'm curious to see what comes out of it. Let's see if more companies jump on the passkey bandwagon, or if it kind of stays as
It'll
it is.
evolve, right? I mean,
Right.
I do think it's encouraging that we're seeing so many different ways of authenticating now, and that we yeah, I think one of the fascinating things is we've all got these strong cryptographic supercomputers in our pockets and on our wrists. So we have all of these ways
Hmm.
of doing things that we just didn't have, yeah, certainly not 10 years ago. So yeah, let's see what comes out of it.
Hmm. So beyond the inevitable new data sets, what else is in the future for Have I Been Pwned?
Yeah, a good question. So guess one of the things that I'm becoming conscious of as I get older is that I need it to not be dependent solely on me. So we've
Hmm.
actually hired our first employee. And when I say
Yeah,
we,
I
it's
saw
my wife
that.
and I. Like
Yeah.
this is like the royal we. It's not a royal we. There is actually two of us, but there's about to be three of us, which is amazing.
Cool.
So Stefan is someone that we've known for a very long time. Works in the same fields. Has got lots of good recognition for the work he's done. Has been a very early adopter of Have I Been Pwned in the companies that he's worked in as well.
Hmm.
So as of about mid-August, he will be a proper full-time employee. And at the very least, if I go out there and get done by shark, snake, crocodile, spider, the usual things, there will be someone else
Hmm.
who can take over and at least keep things running. And I think ultimately we just got to get to a point where, even as I sit here with all these breaches that need verification, disclosure, etc., having people to do stuff like this. And I think it's a bit of the founder's paradox, where it's very hard to let go of things when you've created this thing from scratch. And
Right.
I've done everything from write the code to verify the breaches to every single time there's a logo, I go into Photoshop and I get the logo just right and I optimize it because I'm a detail person. Like it's
Hmm.
been me on everything, and I just have to get away from that.
Okay. So, do you have any other projects, things going on, things in the pipeline that you would want to plug before we sign off here?
No, not really. I mean, to be honest, I just get up each day and I figure it out from there. I waste way too much time doing 3D printing and home automation and other stuff like that. It's really just whatever I
Okay.
find intriguing at the moment. But look, I mean, I'm still traveling and speaking a lot, and
Hmm.
uh, all of that as well. But anything interesting I'm doing, I put on my blog or on my Twitter profile or whatever it is now. I don't know.
Okay. Cool. Well, thank you so much for sitting down with us. It's been an absolute joy talking with you. And I hope everybody at home found this interesting. If you have any questions, please go ahead and leave a comment. Um, Thank you again, Troy, for sitting down with me. It's been awesome.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.